Happy Friday, everyone. Not to mention just a Friday, it's our first Excel Friday, which the enthusiasm is going to be palpable moving forward here. Just all the Excel stuff. So we'll get into that here in just a second. I do want to give an update. Hopefully this will be one of the last first day complete updates I have to give, but I did I think I sent out an email to everybody. It looks like the paywall block has been removed, so those of you who are looking for Connect access can actually get Connect access now. I've seen there's a few more people on Connect. I did have a request from a couple of students who wanted to get physical books. I apologize, I didn't write down names, mostly because I don't have the names now. But I believe there are two of you. The bookstore is ordering the books. They will have those in sometime next week. I'll give you the update when that's the case. So just keeping updated. So yeah, took us a while to get there, but we got there nonetheless. Unfortunately, there are two things that I kind of broke promises for you. First of all, I said I was going to have my first introduction, like my quiz or filling out the questionnaire and response. I'm going to wait until next week to start that. Also, we were scheduled to do the first AI assignment today, but if you recall from on Wednesday, we did not review homework. I think the homework review is more important because that will be on the exam. So I'm pushing back our first AI discussion till week 4. Obviously next week we're not going to do it because we got Labor Day. You guys excited for Labor Day? Yeah. Anybody traveling for Labor Day? Going back home? Okay. Well, I wish all of you safe travels. I'll try not to stand too far in your way. But we're going to be picking up next week. We're going to finish Labor Day weekend and hopefully you're rested and ready because we're probably going to have the most unpleasant chapter in the entire course next week, which is going to be chapter 5. It's going to be on UML diagrams, which are structure diagrams. Trust me when I say that whenever I read evaluations for this course and I read them very thoroughly, the one thing I hear is I hate UML diagrams, and I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. I do hate them too, but I think they're important. So it's kind of one of those things that you have to grudgingly acknowledge their relevance. All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to do Excel Friday, then we're going to review the homework stuff that I wanted to cover on Wednesday. Next semester, I'll make an adjustment on that and make sure that I have plenty of time for both. It will moving forward, we will do our homework review on Wednesday because I know for a fact that our NetSuite assignments will not take us the entire time. It was just a little bit slower than I anticipated this last go around. So as I said, download sample data set 1 from Brightspace, and we're going to get into it. Now, I want to reiterate a point that I've already made. Some of the stuff, especially the early stuff that we're going to be going through, is going to be information that's familiar to you, or we're going to be doing some very remedial tasks. The goal here is not to teach you all information that you already want to know. I'm trying to operate on a level playing field. If you already know everything that I'm about to talk about today, you should feel good because you're prepared for the exam. We will get into more difficult tasks and more challenging functions a little bit later on in the course, but we have to basically crawl before we can walk and walk before we can run. I don't know what the proper analogy is. We have to start out slow before we can move up really fast. I will put this in context that I think are relevant. I'll try to explain situations where I think that you will use certain features and functions. And this first one we're going to be talking about today, this is some remedial stuff. This is a class list, and this is an example of the class list that I download from TrueView every single year. Now, I didn't put anybody's real names in here. These are names of instructors. You see my name's on there, Dr. Deers, Professor Greiner, Dr. Eisen, Dr. Caden, and Dr. Otero. I don't know their middle names, so I just used names from the Harry Potter series. And everybody will say, why did you use Voldemort for Dr. Caden? And I say, if you know Dr. Caden, you know why. All right. So, this is an example of the information that I would detail on that. And this is what I use to create my class roster and then eventually my grade book that I'll use for the semester. So we're going to be doing some basic stuff and setting things up and talking about some of the concerns. Now, like I said, none of this is going to be particularly challenging, but I do think that considering it as a whole can be a little bit overwhelming. So we're going to kind of go through it at a fairly mild pace, a fairly slow pace. So let's go ahead and click on sheet 1. And you will notice here that I've got the banner IDs, but I do not have first names. And you may say, well, it's time for a lookup function. I say, not so fast. We'll get to lookup functions. But for right now, we already know that there's a pretty easy alignment because we only have 6 students and their names are in order of alphabetically. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste those across. So I'm just going to select all the names. I'm just going to copy those. I guess I probably should back up. Okay. So I think everybody probably knows this, but just for posterity, let's go ahead and talk about copying functions. And ultimately, I think probably everybody uses shortcuts, and I encourage you to do so. We talked about kind of the quote unquote holy trinity of shortcuts last Friday when we were talking about our Excel quiz. Control C, Control X, Control V. I tend to use those shortcuts pretty straight or pretty much all the time. I won't say that. I'd say 85% of the time. The only time that I kind of opt away from those, especially on paste functions, is when I'm pasting something that's not exactly what I want. So if I want to copy this information right here, there's a few ways to go about it. If I don't use a shortcut, then I will right click and I'll go up here and just click copy. You can also go up here. Oops, I don't want auto save. By the way, I have autosave turned off. If you have it turned on, that's fine. I have very specific reasons, but I would encourage you to kind of consistently save this information. While it's not a deliverable, it may be helpful for you to review back for this information as you're preparing for the exam. So I encourage you to save as we're going through. I generally don't save very often, especially this, because I want to go back to the blank template. So again, if I want to copy, I could also click on this button right here over in clipboard. It actually has the copies item. But like I said, for copy especially, I usually just Control C. And you can tell that it's copied because it's got that blinking border right there moving around it. Now we're going to copy that over to sheet 1, and I'm just going to Control V. And for very basic purposes, what we've done will work right here. Now, if you're OCD like me, you probably look at this and say, this is not appropriate. I don't like this. This does not match the format that I want. So what are some ways that we can fix this problem? There are a couple of ways that we can go about this. The first one is probably my favorite one, is that instead of pasting just the base value, because I just Control V, I can go up here to paste, and I can select, I just want to paste values, okay? I want to paste values. All right. And this is going to eliminate all formatting. It will also eliminate any formulas that are in there, so you can paste that across. That's one option, and that's an option that I defer to quite frequently whenever I'm doing pasting, especially if I'm using formulas where I only want the values in there. Another option, let's say that I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over and say, all right, it's too late. I've copied it over. I just want to format this. I can actually click a cell that I want to use as my template for formatting, and I can use this thing called Format Painter. So I can click on that Format Painter and then just highlight the cells over here, and it converts it to whatever that format is, which is pretty nice. It's very convenient. But however you choose to copy, it's pretty basic and straightforward. Pretty basic and straightforward. All right, everybody with me so far? Feel like we got mastery of kind of copy, paste, and copy, cut, and paste? I guess we didn't do any cut functions. I'm assuming that everybody knows that if I do cut, it's effectively the same as copy, except I take this and I put it in another spot, which I don't want to do that. I want to leave it in the same place that I had it before. All right, let's do a subtotal. And what would be probably the best function we're going to use for a subtotal function? Sum, yeah, sum. The very basic one, very basic function. So we're going to use the sum function equals SUM, and we're going to highlight this series. Now, a few things I want to point out here. So first of all, I did this manually with my mouse button. Let's say I want to use this on a keyboard and I want to highlight this. Okay. So I can actually go over here to D2. And then what would I hold down to capture a series? Does anybody remember? We talked about this on Friday. Shift. I would hold down Shift and then I'd press the right button. All right. Close the parentheses. Now, what is the difference between using Shift and Control? Control will allow you to capture individual items. Okay. So if you hold down Control, you can collect different items here and capture all of those. Whereas Shift will capture everything in a series. If you hold down Shift and then select Control Shift can be very powerful. So if you could hold down Control Shift, this is probably one of the more advanced things you can do. So I say I'm in D2, I held down Control and Shift. It's going to go all the way over to the right and then all the way down when I press right and down. So you can capture very large amounts of data very quickly using those. So very helpful. All right, second thing I want to talk about, why do we use the sum function? What is the whole purpose? Like I could just go ahead and do the same thing here, but I could say equals D or plus E plus F, get the same information. What is the advantage of something like the sum formula? Right, so you don't have to capture individual information, plus it is adaptive, all right? So if I actually had, let me go ahead and undo this. If I have this right here, let's say I add a grade right in here. So I add a grade in this here. You'll notice the sum function still captures all this. So if I add a number here, Some function will incorporate that, whereas this function will not. So that can be very beneficial. Last thing, we could Control C and then highlight down here and Control V this. Is there a faster way to go about this? Probably is, because I asked, is there a faster way to go about it? So usually one of those rhetorical questions that I'm famous for, yeah. So there you notice there's a little box down here that you can highlight. It changes the symbol a little bit. If you double click on that, it will copy everything down to that. What is that called, by the way? Yeah, flash fill or autofill, one of those two. Yeah. Flash fill or autofill, it's important to note that you do have to have data next to it for it to be useful. Like if I go over here and I say equals this right here, and then try to flash fill it. Well, it did work. That's weird. I guess because of the total. Let me try this again. I know it will not work if you get far enough away. So let's try this again. Maybe eating my own words here. Yeah. So if there's no data in the columns on either side, you can't use flash fill, even if you're referring to a open series. So it does have to have data at least close to it. Used to be that if you didn't have data immediately next to it, it wouldn't work. But I guess it recognized total as a field for that. All right, so we got a subtotal, and then we got extra credit here. Let's go ahead and create a total. We're just going to create a simple total. We're going to add G and H, so I don't anticipate adding anything on there. So pretty basic stuff, pretty basic stuff. By the way, if you're in the situation right now, it's like, I don't know what copying is going on. I don't know some function. I'm just going to manually enter this information. You're behind the curve, okay? You're behind the curve. It's really important that you know how to do these functions. So again, you may want to say, how did you do? You may want to say how did you do it again, but be embarrassed because you don't know. Feel free to come talk to me if you have questions about anything that we do. If you're just embarrassed to talk about it in class, I recognize that. This is something that is important for you to know, not just because it's going to be on the exam, but because you're going to be using Excel a lot in your careers and here at Truman State. So yeah. All right. Let's go ahead and do some cleanup. This is one of those things that I think gets lost. I am a big fan of making sure things look very, very clean and presentable. And I have a lot of things that I do to fix them up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my tips and tricks. Some of them are really basic. Let's go ahead and do the basic ones. Okay. So go ahead and highlight your top row here. And let's just go ahead and add a bold because these are the titles of the areas right here. So we want to distinguish those from everything else. Also, let's center them. Let's center them. Is anybody uncomfortable with the fact that these are all the same width and some of these are not displaying as properly? So yeah, I always have wondered what was the reason for actually having a width of 8.43. That just seems so arbitrary. It's like somebody says, okay, let's put this to 9. No, 9 is too specific. Let's just do somewhere in the middle. 8.5. That's still too specific. 8.43 is really where it's at. All right. So let's go ahead and click on this thing. This is the keystone of the Excel spreadsheet. And this will highlight every cell in the Excel spreadsheet, which is kind of nice because we can actually do a lot with this. This is not the last time we'll use this feature. So first one we're going to use it for is, let's go ahead and click on the right column of A. Okay, just double click on it. And you'll notice because we have the keystone selected, it actually adjusts the width of every single column, which is kind of nice. Kind of nice that it adjusts the width of every single column. Something else I like to do, and this is completely arbitrary, it's up to you, but when you're looking at an Excel or when you're looking at a printed version of this, it does not show those grid lines. But if you're looking at an electronic version, grid lines can be a little bit distracting. So something I like to do if I'm presenting, especially electronically, is I like to go up here and I like to fill with just a white background because that will get rid of those grid lines. Now, it's not a necessary step. You don't have to do that. But if you're doing something like electronic presentation of Excel, you might want to get rid of that to make it look clean. And so that's just a little bit of a tip. What else can we do? Column width. Oh, yeah. Let's go ahead and create a tab title. So there's a few ways to go about this. You can right click and rename, or you can just double click on this. Let's call this gradebook. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be presenting or you have to prepare all your Excel spreadsheets for presentability. I do think that it's kind of gotten lost over many years. It used to be when Excel spreadsheets were kind of at the forefront and everybody was using them consistently. There was a lot of focus on making sure presentation was a big value. I have had a lot of submissions of Excel assignments that were just really can be really challenging. Especially back when I taught 221, I had my students do an Excel assignment for every chapter. Simply, I wanted to get them acclimated to do that. Some of the submissions were really, really challenging to read. You'd get electronic versions where all of the columns were really, really narrow, and it had like number or like those pound signs that we were talking about on Friday because all of them were too narrow. There would be typos. The people would type in words that were not capitalized. It would just be kind of difficult. So one thing I will encourage you to do, especially as it will relate to your work, is to get in the habit of doing at least some formatting on your spreadsheets just to make them presentable. For those of you who are accounting majors, remember I said that I'd say that phrase a lot in this course, who will see me in a semester or two in auditing, there's actually an assignment in Excel where you're graded on your presentability, because you're going to be presenting this as if you're preparing it for a partner. And one of the things a partner will ask is, why does this look so bad? Okay. They've asked me questions like that. So you do have to be conscientious about things like that. So just good to have it to get into. All right, let's talk about the world of deleting. There's a world of deleting. Does anybody play video games? Like, does anybody play like Dark Souls or the Soulsborne type games? Okay. Am I actually reached a generation where everybody's just kind of like, video games are passe, Dr. Barnes? Or is it more like we're Truman students? We don't have time for that. Or nobody wants to admit it. Okay. It's like, how do you know about Dr. S or Dr. Barnes? You're old. Okay. I'm not that old. I'm not that old. So some of those games have the thing called permadeath. Has anybody ever heard of that? I want to teach you about Excel permadeath and how to avoid it. Okay. So there's a few different things about delete that we need to know. So I'm just going to create some data here. I'm going to type 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. This is not, this is not necessary that you need to replicate this, but I want to talk a little bit about the different variations of delete. So some of the versions of delete are pretty mild. Like if I highlight a cell, like I'm going to highlight A2, and I just press delete on the keyboard, it deletes the value from that cell, and that's it. Okay, that's it, which is very easy to fix. I can just hit read undo, and it puts it back into place. So that's kind of the first version of delete. Second version of delete is a little bit more, it's a little bit more detailed in the fact, let's say that we want to get rid of an entire row or entire column. Not just the values within that, because if I highlight that, so let's go ahead and I'm going to put 4, 5, 6 out here. I highlight the row and I hit delete. That will delete the values, but it doesn't delete the row itself. So what if I want to delete that row? If I just want to get rid of it altogether in my spreadsheet? There's a few ways to go about it. My preferred way is to right click and go to delete. And this does something different than just hitting delete. Essentially just removes it from existence, at least until you hit undo, because you can actually undo it. So do the same thing for columns as well. And it gives you the same result. Now, these are not permadeath situations. The permadeath situation is the final delete option that you have. I will caution you, be very, very careful when using this delete option, as it can be very hard to come back from, especially if you have autosave enabled, okay? Because autosave tracks everything that you do, and if you do certain features, some of them you cannot undo. Which type of delete am I talking about? Talking about deleting a worksheet from your workbook, okay? So down here, let's just say we don't need this blank worksheet, or at least this detail, because I just typed some arbitrary values in here. So what's going to happen is I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go up and it's going to say delete. You know what Excel's going to do? If there's no information on there, it's just going to get rid of it, because it's like, okay, there's nothing to worry about. If there is information, it's going to give you this warning right here. I want you to remember these words. Think about your life when you see this message, okay? Think about your life when you see this message, because this could be the point of no return, especially if you've got autosave enabled. Now, has it happened that I've ever had to or that I've ever made a mistake here and had to fix the problem? To my knowledge, it's happened twice. Okay. One time was a 1 hour debacle that I had to fix, that go back and redo everything. Another one time was a 5 hour debacle. Okay. A 5 hour chaos management. That was 6 hours of my life that I won't get back. Okay. 6 hours of my life that I could have used for other things, like walking through a garden or eating a cheeseburger or something like that. Instead, I was replicating data that I deleted like a bonehead. Okay. So yeah, be very, very careful with this, because this could be permadeath. Now, the good news is if we click delete here, we have not saved the file yet. We could just close the file out and just say, all right, we're going to replicate everything we did before, but at least we haven't lost our data. The moment you hit save, that tab is gone, okay? The moment you hit save, the tab is gone, and you're not getting it back. Again, we only typed arbitrary values in there, but if you've got thousands of lines of data, people are going to be very unhappy with you. That is actually one thing that's a big disadvantage of Excel. If you ever do data analytics in Excel, you will often get your managers or the people who are bosses, they will say, all right, copy the Excel file, leave the original one intact, and work with your copy. Why do they say to do that? It's because if you make a mistake, if you delete something, if you change something that can't be fixed, they want to have the original data set in place. Interestingly, more advanced data analysis programs, some that you may have already encountered, Access does this, Alteryx does it, IDEA does it. These advanced data analysis programs, they don't change the underlying data. You can't change the underlying data. You can only add queries to add to the data, which is very, very powerful simply because if you need to go back to your original data set, you always have that original file. So be very careful in Excel when you're making changes because sometimes you can't undo those changes, and that delete tab is one of those. All right, another formatting thing I want to do. Let's just go ahead and highlight these two cells. Oh, by the way, something you may have noticed. I basically went down here, and then I separately highlighted here. How did I do that? Control, yes. I highlighted here, and then I held down Control, and then continued my highlight here. So I'm just going to add, as I said, a highlight. I tend to actually distinguish auto-calculated cells from cells which have manual inputs. It really depends on the situation. Sometimes I'll highlight the cells that require input. Sometimes I'll highlight automatic cells, but I think that's a good distinction to make. All right, let's talk about a few things that you're probably still familiar with, but are a little bit more advanced. Now, we're getting into the realm of territory. We hear me say this a lot. You are not allowed as an Excel user to share this information with the public, okay? We're going to talk about some things that'll make your Excel spreadsheet really, really pop and make it look good. And if somebody asks how you did that, you have to say, well, it's a long and tedious chore. Even though some of the stuff we're going to be doing is very, very simple, you are not allowed to share this with the public. If you do, the Excel police will come after you, okay? We have to make sure that we keep our mystique, all right? So one of the things that actually is kind of interesting to look is freeze panes. Is anybody familiar with freeze panes? So freeze panes, let's say I want to keep this one row. So I want to keep this one row in place when I scroll. So it's not really a big deal with only 6 lines, but if I had thousands of lines, I may want to see what the reference is up here. So we can go to view, not now, and we can say freeze top row. There we go. So that's a possibility. What if I wanted to keep the first column in place? Like I had a lot of information going out to the right and I wanted to keep that. I can instead freeze the first column. That's pretty cool. What I like about it is the flexibility. All right. So what if I wanted to retain the first row and the first 3 columns? Is that even possible? Are we talking about something as difficult as the Fermi paradox here? It is possible, okay? So how do we do this? Well, we actually find the cell where we want to actually our pivot to occur. So if we're in our first row, we want to go below the first row, so something in row 2. And we want to go 1, 2, 3. So we want to keep these 3 columns straight. We want to hit on D2. And when you go up to your freeze panes, it will actually give you the first option, freeze panes. And it's going to freeze panes based on where your cursor is. So let's just go ahead and do that. And there we go. We now have a pivot on the first 3 columns in the top row. This is one that will actually confuse people if they don't know for freeze panes. Like, how did you do that? This is amazing. It's like, well, it takes years of training. Take years of training. Yep, that's what you tell them. That's what you try to tell them. All right, last one we're going to talk about. Last thing we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about conditional formatting. All right. Conditional formatting is one of those ones that I think is really kind of cool, not just for usage, but also for impressing people. So if I've got 6 students, it's very easy to tell who's low performing. Like I've got this student here at 14, this Stacy Caden, a low performer, traditionally low performer. Yeah. But if I've got something like a larger class, like I could probably pick it out in a class of 28 like this one. All right. But I had a class when I was teaching at Oklahoma State during my PhD program that was 140 students. What if I wanted to pick out the low performers in there? And the simple truth was it was about half the class because very few people were showing up for class because they're like 140 students. He won't know if I'm gone. I noticed when like half the class is missing. So, yeah. So what if I want to pick out the poor performers? Like I'm going to do some. So there's a few ways to go about this. Let's go ahead and do a clever one. We're going to do conditional formatting. So let's start in cell I2, and we're going to go back to home key. And I want to go to conditional formatting, and we're going to set a new rule. And for this one, I'm going to do cells that only contain, and I will admit that what I'm about to do is probably not good for accessibility purposes. This is one of my personal preferences. There are different ways that you can actually format your cells. Like you add bold, or you could italicize it, or you could have certain values pop up. I tend to like formatting according to color fill. So I'm going to actually specify my fill is going to be red, which basically anybody who doesn't meet a certain parameter, that's going to appear on the spreadsheet for me. Now, I know by saying this, I've cursed myself, okay? I've cursed myself to where I'm going to be colorblind in a few years, and this whole process that I've set up for myself is no longer going to be useful. I make that joke. I'm not being rhetorical. I'm not trying to tease colorblind students. I actually have had several. It's more along the lines of 5 years ago, I didn't wear glasses when I taught, okay? I could see the screen clearly. That's just getting old, okay? It's the thing that I'm worried about. So I'm going to format my cells with cell value, and I'm selecting format only cells that contain. I'm going to say less than, and we'll say 25. So any cell value that's less than 25, I want this to come up. Yes, sure. So I'm going to go to I2, to cell I2, and select conditional formatting, new rule. I'm going to go format only cells that contain. Are you on online Excel right now? If you are, it's not a big deal. So conditional formatting is a little bit more challenging in an online Excel, but so just make notes of this. Yeah, I I will say my knowledge of online Excel. We actually started with online Excel 2 years ago, and it was frustrating as heck. Okay, because a lot of the things that I want to do in here. So I would encourage you, if you're doing this, to make sure that you're on the version of Excel. But that's okay, because again, you'll have reference back to this because it's being recorded. So yeah, my apologies. I probably should have specified that. All right. So less than 25 formatting for Phil. And you'll notice up here for Michael Barnes is go-getter, so got all the points possible, so it's not a problem. But conditional formatting, like other cell features, can be copied. So let's just go ahead and flash fill this down. And there we go. Our low performer has been highlighted and will be talked to by the instructor. All right. So like I said, I encourage you to save these and hold on to these as you're reviewing back for the exams. You want to make sure that you know these and understand how they're working. But please make sure that you keep up with this. And like I said, this one's pretty easy. The next few will also be pretty easy. We'll get into some more complex ones closer to the first exam and definitely after the first exam. All right. Let's get into homework review. By the way, I apologize for those of you who use the document that I put on Brightspace. I was kind of like not even thinking, and I copied everything and forgot to put the first question. And then I didn't tell my grader, and my grader was like, "Oh, they forgot the first question." And then he realized something was wrong because like about 10 people didn't do the first question. So it's like saying, "Why are these all people first in the first question? They're a bunch of slackers." No, they're not slackers. It was my bad. Like he didn't actually say that. I was just being facetious. But anyway, so we are going to talk about the first question, but you didn't get points off if you missed it simply because that was my fault. That was my fault. Go and take a look. Accounting information systems. By the way, as we're going through these, please make sure that you are taking notes. If you get a question wrong, you obviously want to make sure you get the right question right. Also, if I add additional information, you might want to make notes of that because there's going to be a piece of information that I think that are relevant of value to the exam itself. All right, accounting information systems are also always computerized. So let me ask you this. Do we think we had accounting information systems before computerization? Probably so, okay? They were not as complex or advanced or detailed as computerized systems, but accounting information systems do not need to be computerized. And as we note, a lot of the components of accounting information systems are not computers. What do we think the primary input component is for most accounting information system? Is it the computer itself, or is the people inputting the information? I would say the people are the primary input component. The computer is just a means to facilitate that. If we all had computer brains, we wouldn't need the computer systems themselves. Unfortunately, we're not quite that level of artificial intelligence yet. All right. Report only financial information. Is that true? Has anybody ever looked at a 10K and said, this is all financial information? No, we do report non-financial information and it is very relevant. Are information systems that record, process, report on transactions, and provide financial and non-financial information for decision-making and control. Yeah, so this is kind of encompassing all three of our aspects of the things that we talked about for financial statement information, okay? Information systems record financial and non-financial data and actually relate to decision-making and control. Those are three aspects that we talked about in the lecture. So this is a good definition. So C is our answer. Require CATV designation to understand. That may be a true statement, but especially as they might come up collects, that's technically not the correct answer. Question number 4. Order of events in the value chain. Well, inbound logistics is obviously first, okay? But what is the whole purpose of inbound logistics? So we can actually commence operations. And once we have operations in place, then that's when we have outbound logistics. Now, what were the other two things that we actually had in there, okay? We had marketing and sales comes up. Remember, marketing and sales is going to be subsequent to outbound logistics because we need to have some information to be able to make decisions about marketing and sales decisions. Like if we've never processed any services or sales data, then we can't actually commence marketing activities. So those do occur after outbound logistics, and then service occurs at the very end. Okay, occurs at the very end. So inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, service. All right, question number 6. A supply chain supplies jewelry chains. One of those dorky answers that when you're an accounting professor and you've been teaching this long enough that you take the humor where you can get it, okay? Yeah, obviously we're not talking about supplying jewelry chains, all right? Refers to the flow of materials, information, payments, and services. What do you guys think about that one? Yeah, supply chain actually talks about the supply of materials and information basically from commencement to conclusion, all right? And can include our vendors and even their vendors' vendors and the customers' customers, if that's applicable. All right, customer relationship management software does not include information about. So I will tell you right now, I will not ask a question this transparent or obvious on the exam. I will give you questions that are similar to this vein, but we're going to say that customer relationship management software probably does relate to customers of all types and probably does not relate to people who are not customers. Therefore, it will not contain current employees, okay? Like I say, does anybody ever get into this point where like at Truman and it's like you get a question like this, it's like it can't be that obvious. That Dr. Barnes would never ask us a question that obvious. Sometimes the simplest solution is the correct one. Occam said that. Occam's razor. Yeah. All right. All right. The balance sheet account most likely affected by an AIS investment in supply chain management software would be, okay, so if you remember, we talked about this at the end of lecture 1. We talked about what it is that would be affected by a supply chain. And the way to think about this is the income statement accounts, okay? The income statement or the balance sheet accounts. And so the income statement accounts, and then we also think about the corresponding accounts on the balance sheet. So if I were to say the income statement account that was going to be affected by supply chain management, I'd probably say cost of goods sold. That was what we identified back when we talked about this in chapter. But this doesn't say income statement account. This says a balance sheet account, which you're going to say, Dr. Barnes, we didn't talk about this. I'm paralyzed with fear. I can't answer this question. Well, let's just go back to 221. What does cost of goods sold reflect? The sale of what balance sheet account? Inventory. It actually reflects the transition from being an asset to an expense, that transfer items. So if we were to say that it affects cost of goods sold, correspondingly on the balance sheet account, it probably also affects inventory. All right, so that's the way to think about that. All right, question number 12. Data analytics performed to identify the most profitable customers would be most likely to affect which income statement account? Now, I want you to think about this at a very basic level. When we talk about customers, customers generally generate what in an organization? They generate revenues or sales, okay? If we're talking about vendors, vendors are going to generate costs or expenses. That's really all there is to thinking about this particular type of question. So what is going to be the area that's going to be affected by data analytics over profitable customers? We're probably talking about generation of revenues. Now, what if we were talking about efficiency in vendors? That's probably going to be associated with cost of goods sold or some other expense account. That's all you really need to think about this. Don't make it more complex than it needs to be, okay? I'm not saying you shouldn't think about it. I'm saying that you should come to a conclusion, and if that conclusion seems reasonable given the answers, don't think, well, what about these other options, all right? Question number 14. An auditor testing internal controls would generally be considered to fill which role with respect to accounting information systems? We talked about all of these functions with respect to an information system. All right. We talked about who's filling the roles and what their responsibilities are. Remember, I was particularly proud of the role of the auditor because I used to be an auditor. What does an auditor do? An auditor comes in and replicates tasks and makes sure that what they do matches what the customer has done or what our client has done, what we have done in our situation. So if they had a transaction and it looked like that transaction was supposed to result in $400 in sales, the auditor would reperform that task and see, did that transaction result in exactly $400 in sales? What does that type of testing process seem like to you all? Or what's another word for a tester? An evaluator, okay? An evaluator, somebody who's evaluating the process and make sure it appears reasonable, okay? Which of these represents the proper transformation from data to decision according to the information value chain? Well, we know data starts out. What do we transform data into? What is that called? The thing that I said that I'm going to use them interchangeably, even though I should never do that. It's the problem is that I'm old and too old to change. It's like that phrase saying old dogs can't teach them new tricks. I'm the old dog in this classroom, okay? Yeah. Can't teach an old dog new tricks as much as I might want you to be able to. So what do we transition data into? What's that called? Information, okay? What do we use information for? To gain knowledge. What are you all gaining information in this class? It's like, well, I'm required to take this class, Dr. Varnes. Not that, okay? Say, what are you hoping to gain this information for? To gain knowledge, to make yourself more knowledgeable so that you can use that in your future endeavors. What future endeavors will you be doing? You'll be making decisions about how the organizations operate. So data, information, knowledge, decision. I don't even think you need to memorize that information value chain. It should be fairly intuitive based on the context of each of these definitions, each of these terms. All right, questions from chapter 4. Which of the following is not a role of the accounting function in business? All right. So what is accounting? Do accountants do financial closes? Hopefully you remember that from 220. So those closing entries they had to do. Yep, that's a really important part. Regulatory compliance. Do they have to make sure that the organization follows the rules of the industry they operate in? Yep, that's a really important one. Okay, that's relates to those controls we talked about. Project management. Can accountants do project management tasks? That's not necessarily part of their normal definition, but who's going to manage the project if it's not the accountants? The managers. Okay. Yeah, well, the managers can be part of the accounting team as well. So yes, project management. Can they use IT to make finance and accounting processes more efficient? We hope so. Okay. If not, then nobody else is doing that task. Okay. So accounting function can do all of these. All of these roles all these are roles of the accounting function. All right. Some visual questions here. BPMN, business process model notation. Which of these symbols is used to represent a gateway? So first of all, what is a gateway? What is a gateway supposed to represent? A decision point, okay, where you have to say, all right, there are one or more options that I could take here. I need to actually dictate what is going to be to my decision point, right? How do we actually represent that in a BPMN diagram? Yeah, B, it's a diamond, okay, it's a diamond. What did I say was my preference for BPMN diagrams when you create them with respect to gateways? Should always have what? An opening gateway and a closing gateway, okay? Now, if you don't, I won't count off points, especially if it's one of those things where it's going to be an inclusive gateway or I forget the other term, but all three options are parallel gateways, okay? But I would prefer that exclusive gateways that you always have an opening and closing one, just personal point of preference. It's just good habit to get into. Which of these used to represent a sequence flow in BPMN? Or represent a sequence flow in BPMN? Which of these items? D, the arrow represents the sequence flow. It represents transfers from activities, transfers of information from activities. By the way, is the sequence flow always going to be I shouldn't say sequence flow, is a flow notation in BPMN always going to be a solid arrow? No, it can also be a dotted arrow. That represents if we're actually moving information across departments or across pools, okay? So flows can actually be depicted in multiple ways. Question number 11. Which of the following best describes message flows? Okay, message flows, all right? Message flows are continuous with each pool. Well, we know that's not the case because they can actually move between pools, all right? Message flows are modeled solid arrows. No, they are not modeled solid arrows. Those are sequence flows, okay? Message flows represent exchanges between pools. What do you guys think about that one? That is correct answer, but let's go with the rest. They may not cross pool boundaries. That is the whole point of message pools. If we want to communicate across to different parties, like I say a doctor wants to communicate to a patient, then they need to be able to send a message. That represents that communication, which I would say that's probably a pretty important communication. I've got a doctor's appointment coming up next Thursday, actually. I'm going to be showing up at 7:30 my doctor's office. You know what would have happened if they hadn't told me that or reminded me about my appointment? I'd be still sleeping at 7:30 on next Thursday. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't. That's a good message to have. Cross lane boundaries. Again, they can cross lane boundaries. Those are messages between departments in the organization. So it's important to note that. All right. Moving on to our problems. By the way, did everybody see my big notation to say when you make sure you note that these are problems? Because if you go immediately over here, these are discussion questions, and there's another section called problems. Please be very aware when I use problems and discussion questions. For the first few chapters, it's almost exclusively problems. I think starting in chapter 6, maybe chapter 7, one of those two, I start using discussion questions, and then I know chapter 8, I use both discussion questions and problems. At least that's the plan. I'm still making edits to chapter 8 right now. All right. Question number 4, match the value chain activity in the left column with one in the right column. So let's do this quick, okay? Service activity. Service activity is after the fact, so this is going to be something like warranty work. Everybody got that down? All right, good. Inbound logistics. Inbound logistics would be receiving goods and services that we need for our own production activities. So receiving dock for new materials, so it'd be F. Marketing and sales activity, that's going to be something that actually facilitates the operations and makes them more effective. So surveys for prospective customers so we can actually have new markets to work in. Firm infrastructure. Firm infrastructure could actually mean a number of things, but from the context of our purposes, AIS, who is the firm infrastructure? I did that so I could take a drink. All right. So CEO, CFO, very good. Human resource management. Okay, we need new material or new materials for production, but we also need labor. So what represents labor is going to be our workers. So human resource is going to be our worker recruitment. Procurement. Okay, that's going to be our items that we're going to receive. So procurement technology or procurement items are going to be buying and sourcing raw materials. Now, what's the difference between that and inbound logistics? Okay, procurement is the actual process of acquiring that. Inbound logistics is the process of receiving it. That is an important distinction to make, and one that we will make a much clearer picture of when we get to the purchasing process in chapter 8. Outbound logistics, okay, outbound logistics, we're going to make sure that whatever it is we produce, that we get it to our eventual stakeholder, so delivery to the firm's customer. And then operations, that's going to be the actual production of whatever it is we make, so that would be assembly line in a manufacturing scenario. All right, number 5. By the way, did anybody in number 5 had a lot of straight lines here? Yeah, that was really weird. I couldn't figure out why they did so many straight lines. There's like 5 of them. So yeah, customer call center. This is actually where they're transposing it. So they started out with the scenario or the activity, and they talked about the scenario. Now they've got the scenario and the activity, so they just transposed them. Customer call center. So people call in and say, "I've got a problem." What would that be an example of? Service activity. Very good. Supply schedules. Would that be good in inbound logistics? All right, that's one straight line. All right, order taking. Okay, order taking. What would be an example of order taking? So what are you usually probably, when you're taking an order, what are you generating? Generating a sale. All right, so it's probably marketing and sales activities. So down here at I, yeah. Accounting department. Accounting department, do we need that as a support for our organization? So it probably represents firm infrastructure. 2 straight lines. Staff training, human resource management, 3 straight lines. Research and development, technology, 4 straight lines. All right. Verifying the quality of raw materials. What do you think that would be? So they receive the materials in the receiving dock, and we're trying to make sure that they actually meet our standards. You could say that's a method of inbound logistics, but that probably takes place before we actually move it to the manufacturing process. This is more about making sure that we're getting consistent, strong supplies from our vendors. So what would that be? Procurement, C, okay. Distribution center, that's going to be our outline logistics. That's 5 straight lines. And manufacturing is going to be our operations in a manufacturing facility. So hopefully you got close to that and didn't have too much problem with that. These are all fairly intuitive definitions, particularly for those of you who remember the stuff from 221. All right, we got one more problem to talk about. So this is problem number 2, A through C. Now the main focus of this is part C, but let's talk about A and B real quick, okay? So I talked about Larry getting up and going to class and his situations here. So what is the purpose of the model? It's to actually provide a diagram for Larry's decisions as he provides or starts his day and gets ready to go to class. That one is pretty straightforward. I think everybody can kind of say the purpose is to describe Larry's processes for going to school. All right. And there is a decision point there that we're going to talk about. Now, B, first of all, B is actually new to this edition of the textbook. When I taught this course last year, this B did not exist. Plus, B is not really a question, is it? Yeah, so I noticed a lot of people just kind of skipped over B. It's just kind of like they didn't ask a question. So the next step would be use pools and message flows to describe the context of the business problem across the model. However, there's not a pool in this lab. All right, so what's the question? A really, really badly worded thing. So let's go ahead and talk about this. What is this asking for? It's asking for what is the pool? What is the entity in this particular diagram? So just a question for you all. What is the entity? Or more importantly, who is the entity in this diagram? Larry, that's basically your answer to B. Larry is the pool. Larry is the entity in this diagram, or the context for that. All right, question number C. This is where we're going to pull up a diagram here. So let's see, homework displays. So you needed to create a BPMN diagram, all right? And your activities may vary depending on how detailed you got into this, but it should follow kind of the same context. So we have an alarm sound, which is our starting event. We did have to have a starting event and an ending event. All of these had to be included. Remember, those are required for every BPMN diagram. And this is an important note to make. If you create a BPMN diagram on the exam that does not have a start event or an ending event, you will lose points because those are required events in every BPMN diagram. All right. Obviously required are going to be the activities and flows. So what's our activity? Well, Larry gets up and gets out of bed and dresses, okay? Eats breakfast, prepares for school, then he checks the weather. If you read in the narrative, the weather was a critical point. Because if it was raining or if it was likely to rain, his procedure was different than if it was not. What does that represent? It represents a decision point. It represents a decision point. It's like looking and saying, all right, I do not want to get wet, so I'm going to go ahead and get on my jacket and take an umbrella, drive to school, and then park and walk to class. If it's not raining, then you just basically just not take the jacket and umbrella, which is not a required activity, but a required activity said, I'm just going to walk to school to class because I'm not going to get wet otherwise. But that was an important decision point to make. You will notice that this gateway does have a closing decision, which I think is important. Some of our diagrams moving forward will not have that. But that was what the nature of your diagram needed to look like to some degree. That's what you should be aiming for. If you did not have the level of detail that this diagram had, that is fine, okay? We will get a lot more specific as to the nature of detail that you need to have in your diagram so we get closer to the first exam. That being said, make sure that you take notes on this and keep an eye on this, because this is going to be my expectation for the type of diagram that you're going to be making for the exam. All right, we are done for this week. Have a good Labor Day weekend. I'll see you all on Wednesday.
So I had after like what you wear stuff, that still be acceptable, even though it's been added maybe.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah.